بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين لا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم ربنا آتنا في الدنيا حسنة وفي الآخرة حسنة وقنا عذاب النار. Moving on to lesson number 6, we are covering the section of Tayammum. And what we mean by Tayammum is the dry ablution that a person makes when, in general, when there is no possibility of using water. So since this is a basic text, he's going to focus on the obligatory acts, the sunnah acts, and the mandub acts, and the virtuous acts of Tayammum. And looking at the chapter of Tayammum, according to language, it means to intend to do something. So if you were to say tayammamtu li shay, I intended to do something. According to the Sharia, they call it taharatun turabiyyatun tasta'milu fil wajhi wal yadaini, or tusta'malu fil wajhi wal yadaini. It is, according to the technical term, according to the Sharia, it is a dry ablution that is applied to the hands and the face, because when we make tayammum, we are only making tayammum on the hands and the face, or should we say arms? Yani the arms and the face as a sufficient tayammum, and we do not do the feet. So the first thing the author says, rahimahullah, وَلِلْتَيَمُّمِ فَرَائِدُ وَالسُّنَنٌ وَفَضَائِلُ. Yani for tayammum consists of obligatory acts, sunnah acts, and virtuous acts. He says, فَأَمَّا فَرَائِدُهُ فَأَرْبَعَةٌ. As for the fara'id, for the obligatory acts, they are 4. The first one he mentions is an-niyyatu, yani to have the intention. But contrary to wudu, a person has generally 3 options when making an intention. But in tayammum, one has to have the intention. وَهِيَ أَنْ يَنْوِيَ إِسْتِبَاحَةَ الصَّلَاةِ. He has to have the intention when he's making tayammum that he's making prayer permissible. He is not making tayammum to remove the state of hadith. And what we mean by hadith is the state of non-wudu. For example, when you're making wudu, you're removing a state. You're entering into a state of, you're removing yourself from the you're entering the state of the lesser purity. For example, when you break your wudu and you go and you make wudu, you're removing a state. Meaning you're entering the state of having wudu, and so it's permissible for you to pray. According to the sound position in the Maliki school, when you make tayammum, you are not removing the state. You are not removing the state, but all you're doing is granting yourself permission to make prayer. Understand this point. Again, when you're making tayammum, you're not removing the state that you would when you're making wudu, but what you're doing is by making tayammum, you're granted the permission to pray, although the state is there because you're excused because you cannot find or use water. So that's why he says an-niyyatu. The first one is niyya, وَهِيَ أَنْ يَنْوِيَ, and it is that a person intends istibahat as-salah, that to make prayer permissible. So at the time that you're making your tayammum, you're making the tayammum in order to pray, not in order to remove the state of hadith. That's why he says in the next line, لِأَنَّ التَّيَمُّمَ لَا يَرْفَعُ الْحَدَثَ عَلَى الْمَشْهُورِ, because the tayammum does not remove the state according to the mashhur opinion, which means the sound opinion in the Maliki school. So just before we move on, just so that it's clear, the difference between wudu and tayammum is when you make wudu, you're removing the state of what we call hadith, which we can generally translate it as being in the state of non-wudu. When you make tayammum, although tayammum is a substitute for wudu, you're not removing the state, you're only granting yourself the permission. Tayammum is only granting you the permission to perform the prayer. So the niyyah has to be specific. The second one he mentions, وَتَعْمِيمُ وَجْهِهِ وَيَدَيْهِ إِلَى كُوعَيْهِ. The second one is that you make sure, just like we mentioned in wudu, that you have to have your whole face washed. In tayammum, you have to make sure that when you wipe your face after touching the ground, that you make sure that all of your face has to be wiped. So you cannot miss anything. The sides of the forehead, under the nose, on the sides of the face, you have to make sure that your hand passes over every crevice of your face, and your hands. Your hands, when we mean your hands, up into your wrist. Making tayammum, wiping your hands up until the wrist is obligatory. From the wrist all the way up to the arm is considered a virtuous act, as we'll mention now. What we're talking about is wiping the face and the hands. They have to be totally wiped in tayammum and no spot can be missed. The second one is what darbatul ula. Darbatul ula means to place the hands on the ground. They use the word darb, which actually means strike, but they don't literally mean strike the ground with power. It just means placing the two hands on the ground or on any substance, as we'll mention later, that it's permissible to make tayammum. When we say darbatul ard al-ula, meaning the reason why they mention the first one, the first putting of the hands on the ground, is because the second one, as we'll mention later, is not obligatory, but it is only sunnah. So when you place your hands on the substance, the thing should be big enough that both of your hands can touch the ground at the same time. So for example, you couldn't take a circular rock and form your hand around it in order to make tayammum and then put your other hand on. It has to be a substance in which you can put your both hands on it at the same time. That's the outward meaning of darbatul ula. Then he mentions was-sa'id al-tahir. The fourth obligatory act is as-sa'id al-tahir. As-sa'id al-tahir means that as-sa'id means anything that is naturally from the ground. Al-tahir means that it has to be pure. So he's going to break down this technical term. What does it mean by as-sa'id al-tahir? وهو كل ما صعد على وجه الأرض من تراب أو رمل أو حجارة أو سبخة أو نحو ذلك. It is everything that is on the surface of the earth, including turab, which is dirt or soil, or sand, ramlin, or hijaratin, or rocks, or stone, we should say, or sabakhatin, salt, وَنَحْوِ ذَلِكَ, and anything like that. Here what he's generally referring to is anything that is originally part of the ground can be used for tayammum. So sand, soil, or a rock, or any mineral on the ground, or any type of iron other than gold and silver, any type of metal I should say. Salt can be used, but a few conditions have to be understood here. You cannot use anything that is synthetic or has been changed from its natural substance. For example, the brick that are now used to make houses have been mixed with other things. When we say that you can use rock or stone, it has to be the original substance. So for example, if there was no water, for example, and you were out in the middle of the woods and there's a big rock, or we should say stone, then you can make tayammum on that because that's in its original form. But let's say we were to find a couple bricks. Bricks have been changed, cement has been added, things have been taken out, it's been baked. These things can't be used for tayammum. So as a general rule for beginners, understand that the thing has to be in its original form. So the best thing usually for a person is sometimes tayammum is going to become necessary even when a person is at home. A person can go down by the sea or down by the lake or down by the ocean and find a nice sized rock. And they should always keep one under their bed or somewhere in the house that they can use for tayammum. So that's what he means by وَهُوَ كُلُّ مَا سَعَدَ عَلَى وَجْهِ الْأَرْضِ مِنْ تُرَابٍ أَوْ رَمْلٍ أَوْ حِجَارَةٍ أَوْ سَبَخَةٍ أَوْ نَحْوِ ذَلِكَ. Then he says now he's going, so these are the four, he mentioned the four obligatory acts, and then he's going to move on to the sunnah acts. He says, وَأَمَّا سُنَنُهُ فَثَلَاثَةٌ, they are three. تَرْتِيبُ الْمَسْحِ, yani doing the masah, doing the wiping of the limbs in order. What does he mean by wiping of the limbs in order? To wipe the face before the hands. So when you're making tayammum, the first wiping that you're going to do is wipe the face and then wipe the hands. And then he says, وَالْمَسْحُ مِنَ الْكُوعَيْنِ إِلَى الْمِرْفَقِ, yani, and then wiping from the wrist up to the arms. As I mentioned to you before, what is obligatory is to wipe your hands up to the wrist. That's obligatory. Doing the sunnah completely would be to do from the tip of the hand all the way up to the elbow. Then he says, وَتَجْدِيدُ الدَّرْبِ دَرْبَةِ لِلْيَدَيْنِ, meaning the renewing, or in other books we'll call it the second striking. For example, we mentioned that the obligatory act, one of the obligatory acts is the first placing of the hands on the ground. So after placing your hands on the ground for the first one, you're going to put your hands on the ground and then you're going to wipe your face. After you finish wiping your face, technically speaking, you can go and do your hands directly if you wanted to. But it's sunnah to put your hands back on the ground before you wipe your hands and your arms. So that's a sunnah. So the first placing of the hands on the ground is obligatory, and the second one, after you finish doing your face, before you do your hands, then placing your hands on the ground a second time is considered a sunnah. So these are the three sunnahs: doing the wiping in order, wiping from the wrist up to the arm, and putting your hands on the ground a second time for the sake of wiping your hands. And then the third one that he mentions was وَأَمَّا فَضَائِلُهُ فَثَلَاثَةٌ أَيْضًا. As for the fada'il, the virtuous acts, they are three. At-tasmiyatu, the first one is to say Bismillah. Without, according to the Malikis, Bismillah without ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, you just say Bismillah. ثُمَّ بِالْبَاطِنِ إِلَى آخِرِ الْأَصَابِعِ. Or sorry, my bad, he says وَالْبَدْءُ بِمَسْحِ ظَاهِرِ الْيُمْنَى بِالْيُسْرَى إِلَى الْمِرْفَقِ ثُمَّ إِلَى الْبَاطِنِ إِلَى آخِرِ الْأَصَابِعِ. The second one is when you do the arm. When you're wiping the arm, it is preferable to do the outside of the arm before you do the inside. So what do you mean by the outside of the arm? The arm that is the opposite of the palm. That's what I mean by the outside. So the outside, meaning the side that faces the side that the elbow is on, it's virtuous to do that side and then to do the inside. Then he mentions وَمَسُّ الْيُسْرَى مِثْلَ ذَلِكَ وَاللَّهُ أَعْلَمُ, and then wiping the left hand the way you did the right side. So starting with the right side is also virtuous, and then going to the left side, just as it is virtuous to do the outside of the arms before you do the insides. And then he says Wallahu alam, and Allah knows best. And so this is just a basic summary of how to make tayammum, and the other books of fiqh mention more detail, but the purpose of this book is to cover the fundamentals of each action. Allahumma salli ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'een.